The dusty streets of Redemption Creek stretched before me like a scar across the desert floor, shimmering in the heat of another unforgiving Arizona afternoon. I'd ridden into this godforsaken town with nothing but a weathered badge pinned to my vest and a reputation that preceded me like thunder before lightning. Sheriff Marcus Holloway, they called me, the man who'd cleaned up 3 frontier towns in as many years. The townspeople watched from behind their curtains as I dismounted, their eyes filled with the same mixture of hope and fear I'd seen countless times before. This place reeked of corruption and desperation, the kind that made honest folk lock their doors at sunset. The saloon doors swung open with a creak that seemed to echo through my very bones, and out stepped a figure that made my blood run cold. Josiah, Blackjack McKenna, stood there with his coal-black hat tilted low over eyes that held the promise of violence, his hand resting casually on the pearl handle of his Colt 45. He was everything the wanted posters claimed and more, 6 feet of lean muscle wrapped in leather and arrogance. The bounty on his head was enough to buy a small ranch, and half the lawmen in the territory had tried and failed to bring him in. His gang had terrorized this region for months, robbing banks, rustling cattle, and leaving a trail of bodies in their wake. But as I studied his face in the dying light, something didn't sit right with me. There was intelligence in those dark eyes, a calculating look that spoke of a man who thought several moves ahead of his opponents. The way he carried himself wasn't the swagger of a mindless killer, but the measured confidence of someone who knew exactly what he was doing. Most outlaws were driven by greed or desperation, but Blackjack seemed different somehow. When he tipped his hat to me in mock courtesy, I caught a glimpse of something unexpected, a flash of what almost looked like relief. The mayor, a nervous little man named Cornelius Wheaton, scurried up to me like a prairie dog emerging from its hole. His hands shook as he mopped his sweating brow with a handkerchief that had seen better days, and his voice cracked when he spoke. "Sheriff Holloway, thank the Lord you've arrived," he wheezed, casting furtive glances toward the saloon where Blackjack had disappeared. "That devil and his gang have been bleeding this town dry for 3 months now." The way his eyes darted around suggested he was more afraid of being overheard than of the outlaws themselves. What struck me as odd was how well-dressed the mayor appeared despite his claims of the town being bled dry. His pocket watch was solid gold, his boots were polished leather from back east, and his suit was finer than anything a frontier mayor should be able to afford. When I mentioned this observation, his face flushed red and he stammered something about family money, but I'd been a lawman long enough to recognize a lie when I heard one. The pieces of this puzzle weren't fitting together the way they should, and that always made me suspicious. As evening approached, I made my rounds through the town, talking to the shopkeepers and residents about their troubles with the McKenna gang. Most of them seemed genuinely afraid, but their stories were inconsistent in ways that troubled me. Old Martha Henderson claimed they'd stolen her life savings, but she couldn't explain why her general store was still well stocked with expensive goods. Tom Sullivan said they'd rustled half his cattle, yet his ranch appeared prosperous, and his hired hands were well fed. Something was rotten in Redemption Creek, and it wasn't just the usual frontier lawlessness. The local doctor, a thin man named Abraham Cross, invited me for dinner at his modest home on the edge of town. Over a meal of beans and hardtack, he told me stories that painted a different picture of the McKenna gang. "They never hurt anyone who didn't fight back," he said quietly, glancing around as if afraid of being overheard. "And strange as it sounds, Sheriff, they always seem to know exactly who to rob and who to leave alone." His words sent a chill down my spine because they suggested the gang had inside information about the town's residents. That night, as I sat in the sheriff's office cleaning my guns, I heard gunshots from the direction of the bank. By the time I reached the scene, Blackjack and 2 of his men were riding hard out of town, saddlebags bulging with what appeared to be stolen money. But as I examined the scene, nothing made sense. The bank's safe was blown open, but there were no signs of a struggle. The bank president, Harold Ashworth, was unconscious but unharmed, and when he came to, his story was full of holes bigger than a buckshot pattern. I spent the rest of the night going through the bank's records, and what I found made my hands shake with anger. There were loan documents charging impossible interest rates, foreclosure notices on properties that should have been paid off, and records of money being transferred to accounts in Denver and San Francisco. This wasn't just a simple case of outlaw theft. This was systematic robbery of the legal kind. The very people who were crying for protection from Blackjack McKenna were the ones who'd been robbing the town blind for years. As dawn broke over the desert, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, I realized that everything I thought I knew about this case was wrong. The The real criminals weren't riding horses and wearing bandanas. They were wearing suits and hiding behind badges and bank accounts. Blackjack McKenna might be an outlaw, but he wasn't the villain in this story. The true evil had been wearing a respectable mask all along, and I was about to discover just how deep this corruption ran. The morning sun cast long shadows across the desert floor as I rode out to track the McKenna gang, but my heart wasn't in the chase anymore. Everything I'd discovered at the bank kept churning in my mind like a dust devil, refusing to settle into any pattern that made sense. My horse, a reliable chestnut mare named Liberty, seemed to sense my uncertainty and picked her way carefully along the rocky trail that led into the Badlands. The tracks were easy enough to follow, 3 horses heading northeast toward the canyon country, where outlaws traditionally made their hideouts. But something nagged at me about how obvious this trail was, as if they wanted to be followed. By midday, I caught sight of smoke rising from a hidden canyon about 2 miles ahead, and I knew I'd found their camp. Instead of charging in with guns blazing like most lawmen would have done, I decided to approach with caution and observe. What I saw through my field glasses nearly knocked me out of the saddle. Blackjack McKenna was tending to a wounded man, his movements gentle and careful like those of a man who'd had medical training. The other members of his gang were sharing their water with what appeared to be a family of settlers whose wagon had broken down nearby. I worked my way closer through the rocks and scrub brush, keeping low and moving slow to avoid detection. From my new vantage point, I could hear their conversation clearly, and what I heard shattered everything I thought I knew about these men. The Hendersons lost their farm yesterday, Blackjack was saying to his lieutenant, a grizzled man called Dakota Pete. Ashworth foreclosed on them even though they'd paid every cent they owed. His voice carried a weight of sadness and anger that no cold-blooded killer should possess. Dakota Pete spat into the dust and shook his head in disgust as he spoke about the bank president. That snake's been doctoring the books for years, boss. Makes folks think they owe more than they do, then steals their land when they can't pay the fake debt. The wounded man they were tending turned out to be Will Henderson, Martha's son, who'd been beaten by the bank's hired thugs when he tried to protest the foreclosure. These weren't outlaws terrorizing innocent people. They were trying to protect them from the real criminals. The family of settlers they were helping consisted of a young mother named Sarah Collins and her 2 small children, whose husband had been killed in a suspicious accident at one of Mayor Wheaton's mines. Blackjack pressed a bag of coins into her hands, and I realized it was probably money from the bank robbery, money that was being returned to its rightful owners. "This should get you and the children to your sister's place in Colorado," he told her gently. "Start fresh where Wheaton and his cronies can't reach you." As I listened to more of their conversation, the true picture of Redemption Creek began to emerge like a photograph developing in a dark room. The town's leading citizens, Mayor Wheaton, Bank President Ashworth, and several others, had formed a conspiracy to steal everything they could from the honest residents. They used legal manipulation, false debts, and outright intimidation to drive families from their homes and businesses. Blackjack McKenna and his men were the only thing standing between these corrupt officials and complete control of the territory. The irony of the situation hit me like a punch to the gut. I'd been sent here to arrest the only honest men in the county. My reputation as a lawman who cleaned up corrupt towns had made me the perfect tool for the real criminals to use against their enemies. They probably figured that once I eliminated Blackjack and his gang, there would be no one left to oppose their schemes. The wanted posters, the bounties, even the stories of their supposed crimes, it was all carefully orchestrated propaganda designed to turn the law against the very people trying to uphold justice. I was so lost in these revelations that I almost missed the sound of riders approaching the canyon from the opposite direction. Through my field glasses, I could see a group of armed men wearing deputy badges, but I recognized them as the same hired thugs who'd been terrorizing the townspeople on behalf of the corrupt officials. They were led by a vicious gunslinger named Clay Morrison, whose reputation for brutality was well earned. These weren't lawmen coming to arrest outlaws. They were assassins coming to eliminate witnesses. Blackjack and his men had heard them coming too, and I watched as they quickly broke camp and prepared for a fight they couldn't possibly win. Dakota Pete was trying to get the Collins family to safety, while Blackjack checked his ammunition with the calm professionalism of a man who'd faced death many times before. The wounded Henderson boy was in no condition to ride, and they all knew that staying to protect him meant they'd probably die in this forgotten canyon, but none of them seemed willing to abandon him to Morrison's tender mercies. That's when I made the decision that would change everything. I couldn't let good men die while evil ones prospered. Drawing my rifle, I took careful aim at Clay Morrison and squeezed the trigger, watching him tumble from his saddle with a hole in his shoulder. The sound of the shot echoed off the canyon walls like thunder, and suddenly I found myself in the middle of a gunfight, shooting at men who wore badges just like mine. As bullets whined past my head and ricocheted off the rocks around me, I realized that sometimes the law and justice weren't the same thing at all. The gunfight that followed was unlike anything I'd ever experienced in my years as a lawman. With bullets flying in every direction, as good and evil became hopelessly entangled in smoke and chaos. Blackjack McKenna proved to be every bit the skilled gunfighter his reputation claimed, but he used his abilities to protect rather than destroy. I watched him cover Dakota Pete, while the older man helped the Collins family escape through a narrow passage in the canyon wall. Meanwhile, I found myself fighting alongside the very men I'd come to arrest, united by a common enemy that wore the badge of law while serving the cause of corruption. Clay Morrison, despite his wounded shoulder, rallied his remaining thugs for another assault on our position among the rocks. "Kill them all!" he screamed, his voice echoing off the canyon walls like the cry of a wounded animal. "Dead men can't testify about what they've seen." His words confirmed what I'd already suspected. This wasn't just about eliminating Blackjack's interference with their schemes. They needed to silence anyone who could expose the truth about Redemption Creek's supposed leading citizens. The battle raged for what felt like hours under the merciless desert sun, with the advantage shifting back and forth like sand in the wind. Blackjack's men were outnumbered, but they knew the terrain and fought with the desperation of cornered wolves. I found myself admiring their courage and skill, even as I wondered how I'd explain shooting at fellow lawmen when this was all over. Every shot I fired felt like a betrayal of everything I'd believed about justice and the law, yet I knew in my heart that I was finally on the right side of a fight. During a brief lull in the shooting, Blackjack worked his way over to my position behind a cluster of boulders. Up close, I could see the intelligence and determination in his eyes, along with something else, a bone-deep weariness that spoke of a man who'd carried a heavy burden for too long. "You're Sheriff Holloway," he said, and it wasn't a question. "Why are you helping us?" The way he asked it suggested he'd been betrayed by lawmen before and had good reason to be suspicious of my motives. I told him about what I'd discovered in the bank records and my growing realization that the real criminals were wearing suits instead of spurs. He listened with the focused attention of a man who'd learned that details could mean the difference between life and death. "Ashworth's been stealing from this town for 5 years," he said quietly. "Wheaton provides the political protection, and Morrison provides the muscle. Anyone who gets too close to the truth ends up dead or driven away." Then Blackjack told me something that made my blood run cold. They had evidence of the conspiracy hidden in a cave nearby, including financial records and correspondence that would expose the entire network of corruption. "We've been gathering proof for months," he explained, "but no lawman would listen to a wanted outlaw's accusations against respected citizens." His words hit me like a physical blow, because I realized how many other innocent people must have died while good men like him were dismissed as criminals. The sound of approaching hoofbeats interrupted our conversation, and we both knew that Morrison had called for reinforcements from town. Through the heat, shimmer rising from the desert floor, I could see at least a dozen more riders heading toward the canyon at full gallop. Among them, I recognized Mayor Wheaton himself, along with several other prominent citizens I'd met during my brief time in Redemption Creek. They'd come to witness the elimination of their enemies personally, probably planning to claim credit for bringing down the notorious McKenna gang. As the new arrivals took positions around the canyon's rim, effectively surrounding us, Blackjack made a decision that showed the kind of man he really was. "Henderson's too hurt to ride, and the cave with our evidence is on the far side of the canyon," he said grimly. "Someone needs to get that proof to the outside world, even if the rest of us don't make it out alive." He was asking me to abandon the fight and carry the truth beyond the reach of Wheaton's corruption, knowing it might be the only chance for justice to prevail. Before I could respond, Clay Morrison's voice boomed across the canyon from his position on the opposite rim. "You're surrounded, McKenna. Send out Sheriff Holloway, and we might let the rest of you die quick." His offer revealed the depth of their desperation. They needed me dead because a respected lawman's testimony could destroy their carefully constructed lies. But it also told me that they still thought I was their tool, sent to eliminate their enemies rather than expose their crimes. The irony of the situation wasn't lost on any of us. The hunters had become the hunted, and the law had become the enemy of justice. As the sun climbed higher in the desert sky and the temperature rose toward unbearable levels, I realized that this canyon might become our tomb unless we could find a way to turn the tables on our enemies. The evidence of their corruption was tantalizingly close, but it might as well have been on the moon if we couldn't survive long enough to retrieve it and get it to someone who would listen. The plan we devised was desperate and dangerous, but it was our only chance to expose the truth before Morrison's men closed in for the kill. While Blackjack and Dakota Pete created a diversion by engaging the gunmen on the canyon's east rim, I would circle around through a series of connected caves to retrieve the evidence they'd hidden. The wounded Henderson boy insisted on helping despite his injuries, claiming he knew these caves better than anyone since he'd explored them as a child. His determination to see his family's tormentors brought to justice gave him strength that his battered body shouldn't have possessed. The caves were a labyrinth of narrow passages and hidden chambers, carved by centuries of flash floods and wind erosion. Henderson guided me through the darkness with the confidence of a man following a familiar trail, while above us, the sound of gunfire echoed like distant thunder. In the deepest chamber, we found what Blackjack had described, a cache of documents, photographs, and ledger books that told the complete story of Wheaton's conspiracy. Bank records showing fraudulent loans, correspondence between the conspirators discussing their victims, and even photographs of properties stolen through legal manipulation. As we gathered the evidence, Henderson told me his story in whispered words that burned with quiet rage. His father had been the town's previous sheriff, an honest man who'd gotten too close to exposing Wheaton's schemes. One night, he'd simply disappeared, and his badge had been found beside the river along with a note claiming he'd taken bribes and fled in shame. "They murdered him and made it look like corruption," Henderson said, his young voice carrying a weight of sorrow no boy should bear. "Blackjack's the only one who believed the truth and tried to help us." The sound of approaching footsteps in the cave system sent us scrambling for cover, but instead of Morrison's thugs, we found Dakota Pete making his way toward us through the darkness. "Boss sent me to help," he whispered urgently. Morrison's boys found the main entrance, and we're running out of ammunition. The old gunfighter's face was grim as he explained that their diversionary attack had been more successful than expected. They'd wounded several of the corrupt deputies, but now they were trapped in their own hiding places. Working together, we managed to gather all the evidence into several saddlebags, but getting it out of the caves and away from the canyon would require a miracle. That's when Henderson revealed his final secret. There was another exit from the cave system that emerged behind a waterfall about a mile downstream. It was treacherous and partially flooded, but it would bring us out well beyond Morrison's cordon. "My pa showed me that passage years ago," he said with a sad smile. "Said it might come in handy someday if the wrong people ever took over the town." The journey through the flooded passage was a nightmare of slippery rocks and rushing water, with the precious evidence bags held high above our heads to keep them dry. More than once I thought we'd all drown in the darkness, but Henderson's knowledge of the cave system kept us moving in the right direction. When we finally emerged behind the waterfall, gasping and soaked but alive, the sun was beginning its descent toward the western horizon. We'd been underground for hours, and the sound of gunfire from the canyon had stopped completely. From our hidden position behind the waterfall, we could see the full scope of Wheaton's operation as his men searched the canyon for our bodies. They moved with the casual confidence of men who believed their enemies were all dead or dying, and I realized they probably thought the evidence had been destroyed in the fighting. Mayor Wheaton himself was directing the search, his expensive clothes incongruous among the desert rocks as he pointed and shouted orders. The mask of respectability had finally slipped completely, revealing the greedy predator beneath. But our triumph was short-lived, because as we prepared to make our escape with the evidence, Clay Morrison appeared at the top of the waterfall with his gun drawn. "Well, well," he sneered, his wounded arm hanging useless at his side, but his shooting hand steady as granite. The famous Sheriff Holloway turned outlaw himself. "Wheaton's going to be real disappointed when he hears about this." His finger tightened on the trigger, and I knew we were about to die just yards away from freedom and justice. That's when Blackjack McKenna stepped out from behind the rocks where he'd been waiting, his own gun trained on Morrison's back. "Not every outlaw deserves a noose, Morrison," he said quietly, "but every corrupt lawman does." The shot that followed echoed across the desert like the crack of divine judgment, and Clay Morrison tumbled into the pool below the waterfall, his career of brutality finally ended. Blackjack had risked everything to follow us, and ensure the evidence reached safety, even though it meant abandoning his defensive position in the canyon. As the sun set over the Arizona desert, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, we made our way toward the territorial capital with proof of the conspiracy that had poisoned Redemption Creek. Blackjack McKenna rode beside me, no longer an outlaw in my eyes, but a man who'd chosen justice over law when the two had diverged. The real villains were the ones who'd hidden behind badges and bank accounts, stealing from the innocent, while convincing the world that good men were evil. Sometimes the truth isn't found in wanted posters or legal documents, but in the courage of those willing to stand against corruption wherever it wears its mask. And sometimes the real heroes are the ones society has branded as criminals,